As the month of October is considered by a lot of people, including myself, the spooky scary month, I make it an annual thing to play at least one horror game on that month, whether it be a brand new horror game that I've never experienced or one that I've already played before. Horror games are one genre that I genuinely enjoy playing a lot, but I know some players don't play this genre at all. This made me remember something from when I was a lot younger. Back then, I wouldn't dare play a horror game even if it was in broad daylight. This was due to me having a core memory from a certain scene that occurred in the original Resident Evil 2 from the PS1 while I was watching my brother play it, which ultimately sparked my fear of zombies and the dark. To this day, I still remember that scene and the nightmares that came along with it, but it also makes me remember that I was once in the position of not wanting to play horror games at all and just watch someone else do it. This all changed when all the PS1 Resident Evil games went on sale back on the PSN store, and I decided to buy all of them, at first hoping that my brother would play these and I would be able to watch from the side. But then a thought came through my mind, which was, I know he isn't going to be able or want to play these all the time. I think it's best for me to start facing this fear I have from when I was younger and play them myself. And so, I booted up the very first Resident Evil game and played through it completely on my own without handing the controller to my brother once. I can admit that on that first playthrough, I was terrified, but I was proud of myself for being able to take the initiative and rely on myself for the entire playthrough. Once I finished my playthrough of the first Resident Evil, I went on to the second game in the series, this time not having as much fear of it as before, but still scared knowing that I would be playing the game that caused my core memory. And like with the first game, I beat the entire game on my own without any assistance, but this time, even though I was scared in some parts of the game, I ended up having an extremely fun time playing it for the first time. I did the same process of playing all the Resident Evil games in chronological order until reaching the last game in the series that was available to me at the time. But with each game I finished, the fear I had from zombies and the dark started to just become a distant memory for me. I had successfully faced my fear and discovered a new genre of games that to this game really enjoy playing and discussing about with my brother. This is where I would like to share my personal advice on how to get started with playing horror games for the first time and help facilitate your experience when diving into this genre. This advice can apply to any brand new horror game that just released, or one that's been around for a while and you haven't gotten the chance to play it. The first bit of advice I have is probably one of the most interesting ones at first glance, which is to start easy with horror games that you don't find to be too scary to play. One thing that I didn't mention is that the very first horror game I had ever played was actually the original Dead Space, not Resident Evil. This is something that I didn't mention before, since Dead Space was a horror game that I didn't find to be as scary as Resident Evil. But since it shared a lot of horror tropes that are used among other horror games, it helped me in giving me a better understanding of what I can expect when going into scarier games in the future. Let me give a little bit of extra detail on the types of horror games that I've played so far, as well as a little bit of characteristics to tell them apart. Now, on which type you decide to try out first or after getting accustomed to horror games is completely up to you. Do keep in mind that there are other types of horror games available that I personally haven't had the chance to experience. Classic survival horror. This is the type that's most commonly used in horror games. Its characteristics mostly involve exploration, puzzle solving, and evading anything that is lurking around the setting of your selected game. This is the type of horror game that's primarily the easiest to play and a great place to start. Examples of this type are Resident Evil and The Evil Within, but more horror games can share this type. Psychological horror. This type primarily focuses in disturbing your psychological state. A lot of its characteristics involve using elements to frighten, disturb, or unsettle your mental and emotional state. In my opinion, this is the hardest type of horror game to go into, especially if you have very low morale. Examples of this type are Silent Hill and Doki Doki Literature Club. Sci-fi horror. This type primarily focuses on either extraterrestrial beings that are unknown to us, or any type of experimentation that went wrong in the game setting. A lot of its characteristics can involve a lot of body disfiguration, and the fear of unknown beings.
You got this, man. Jesus Christ, it's all good.
You saw nothing, sir.
This is the type that I started out with, as it can be extremely similar to classic survival horror, but with a more futuristic setting. Examples of this type are Dead Space and Alien Isolation. Since we're on the subject of horror types, my second bit of advice is to grow accustomed to the horror tropes used in your selected game. This can vary for each individual player's choice of game, as not all horror tropes can appear in the game you have selected. In my case with Dead Space, I grew accustomed to jump scares, suspense building, and keeping my composure upon seeing multiple necromorphs coming directly at me. More horror tropes could be used in your selected game, but do keep in mind that you most likely won't be exposed to all of them in one go. But this will help you in being prepared if the tropes seen in your selected game are used in future horror games. My third bit of advice is probably going to be the hardest to learn, and that is, learn to keep your composure when seeing and experiencing something that you find scary or disturbing upon encountering it for the first time. This is something that I consider the hardest to learn when playing horror games for the first time, as a lot of our natural instincts can kick in when seeing something that we find scary or disturbing. A lot will choose to run and avoid whatever causes this fear. while others may choose to embrace it and fight back instead after being exposed to it. But one thing to note, no matter what option you choose in a fight or flight scenario, doing your selected action in a hysterical state will always bring more trouble or put you at a huge disadvantage in future sections of your selected game. Do your best to always keep your composure in most, if not all, scenarios that you encounter for the first time. My fourth bit of advice goes hand in hand with keeping your composure throughout your experience, and it's to look at your character's body language when exploring different areas. The reason why I'm saying that this goes hand in hand with keeping your composure is mostly because if you are in a hysterical state while playing your selected game, you will fail to notice any subtle changes your character does upon entering a new area, as well as seeing if your character is looking at something that may require your attention. This can also include any tense movement they may give off when being close to a threat, or changes in their voice/breathing. My fifth and most important bit of advice is to keep progressing at your own pace. Don't worry about how fast or how slow you are progressing in your selected game. This is something that I've always kept in mind when playing a horror game, regardless if it's something that I've already played before or one that's a brand new experience, as all players have different levels of how much fear they can handle before stepping away for a while. Always be sure to take breaks if needed and come back when you are ready once again. As you're getting this information I've provided, you may be asking yourself, so with this advice that you provided, will I be able to breeze through horror games? In short, no. There's definitely going to be struggles that you're going to encounter, especially if it's your very first time either playing a horror game or going into a brand new game that you haven't experienced yet. Let's go into each piece of advice I provided before, but this time, I'll be providing the struggles you'll face to better prepare you for what you can expect in your personal experience. In my first bit of advice, I mentioned to start with horror games that you don't find too scary to play. This can sometimes be hard to do if you don't exactly know what scares you and might end up playing a game that's way above your personal limit at first, which could result in you dropping out of the experience altogether. In my personal experience, when I was terrified of zombies and the dark, I tried jumping into Resident Evil with no prior experience in horror games and ended up backing out for an extended amount of time. But I went back into the franchise when I knew I was ready to give it another try. But take it from my own experience, not all players are going to willingly go back into a franchise after their first experience. Hence why trying out and experiencing different horror games will help in preparing you for when you decide to return to that franchise. Let's go into each of the mentioned horror games' characteristics and describe each struggle you'll face when experiencing them. For classic survival horror, the biggest struggles you'll face are finding and managing your resources. This is a struggle that I had to learn when playing Resident Evil, as you do start with a limited amount of resources and are forced to find more on your own. If you're a player that normally speeds through a section due to being scared of what's lurking around, you may find yourself missing a lot of resources that could be used to help you in the long run. For managing your resources, although you may have a large amount of resources upon collecting as much as you can, you may start to get reckless and end up using way more than needed, leaving you with little to no resources in future sections where you'll be in need of them. Although this struggle isn't exclusive to classic survival horror games, this type of game is the one that will prepare you the most when dealing with it. For psychological horror, the biggest struggles you'll face are keeping both your personal morale and energy in check. The reason why I'm saying this is due to the fact that psychological horror games will normally drain your personal energy and prevent you from proceeding further. This is much more noticeable when you encounter a section that either reminds you of a personal memory or gives you a sense of disturbance. If you're starting to feel your personal energy draining, such as getting tired, get to a safe spot like a save station in your current game, and take a break until your personal energy and morale are back to a normal level. Once you are recharged, resume your playthrough, but now with the knowledge of what type of subjects will be used against you. For sci-fi horror, a lot of struggles are shared with classic survival horror, but the one struggle that can be unique to these types of horror games are the type of unknown creatures that could appear in your selected game. This can be made up of any humans that have had their body composition shifted to something that's out of the ordinary due to a biological outbreak, such as the necromorphs in Dead Space, or any creatures that are completely unknown to us and don't have any information as to why they are in your selected game, other than wanting to catch or hunt you down for their own purposes, such as the xenomorph from Alien Isolation. For growing accustomed to the horror tropes mentioned in my second bit of advice, the struggles you'll face will vary on how you personally take these tropes. Some will find certain horror tropes easier to take on, while others will find them difficult to manage. This all depends on how often you have been exposed to them in other games. Your own personal experience dealing with as many horror tropes as possible will make it easier for you to deal with it in the long run, but do keep in mind that they'll be tough to deal with the first couple of times you encounter them. In my third bit of advice, I mentioned that keeping your composure when encountering something you find scary being the hardest to learn. This is also true for its respective struggle. The fight or flight scenario is something that you'll always have to keep in the back of your mind in every horror game you decide to play. Sometimes you'll be placed in a scenario that you're forced to either fight what's ahead of you or escape. As such, it's always best to have previous experience of what you would do in both situations so you aren't caught off guard. Of course, this is easier said than done. As such, there are times in which you'll have to make a combination of both choices in your current scenario to come out victorious. Always do your best to keep your composure and don't let your emotions make hysterical choices for you. With my fourth bit of advice, looking at your character's body language can have a struggle that's a double-edged sword, as your character can sometimes be in an alerted state regardless of what or where the current threat is at. This can leave you on your guard for an extended amount of time, not knowing that the current threat isn't even in the same room as yourself. On the flip side, if you're looking at your character's body language throughout your experience, you might end up finding sections or resources that you weren't aware of before, as well as knowing when you are completely away from any threats, regardless of what section you are currently in, leaving you in a much more relaxed state. Do keep in mind that there are some horror games that feature little to no body language for your character, so be sure to both see and listen closely to anything that may be around your current environment. On my last bit of advice, I had mentioned to make progress at your own pace. This unfortunately has the biggest struggle to overcome. This is mostly due to your personal limit and how long it takes for you to return to your selected horror game and resume your experience. Some may leave for an extended amount of time, while others may never wish to resume their experience. This is especially harder to do when you face something that leaves you frightened. In my personal experience, I had difficulty progressing in Alien Isolation due to knowing that once I booted up the game again, I was going to be stalked and hunted down by the xenomorph. But pushing through and overcoming that fear I had from the xenomorph helped me in being able to handle more intense horror games I chose to play in the future. Of course, everyone has their personal limits. I'm no exception to that. Keep in mind that there are times that the progression you do in a game can sometimes be limited to the amount of times you can save your progress. The classic Resident Evil games really show you the importance of how much progress you need to do so that you can comfortably save your progress and pick up at a later time. Other horror games do have this type of saving system implemented into them, while others may have slight variations that essentially function the same way. If you're going to take a break from your current game, always be sure to save your progress in a section that you know you're going to be able to come back to without any issues and aren't accidentally caught off guard once you resume your experience. I hope that with this information I provided you about what you can expect with horror games, it gives you a heads up of what you can expect when playing these types of games. All experiences will ultimately vary for each individual player in the long run, but I'm hoping that with this information I provided, you aren't completely lost and are able to experience this genre to further expand your gaming selection in the future. And while you're down in the comments, share with me either the scariest game you've played so far, or the game you're currently playing for the Halloween season. The scariest game I have played so far is Alien Isolation, and the game I'm currently playing for the Halloween season is Silent Hill 2 Remake. See you all next time.